Patrick's name is forever linked to Operation World, that unique prayer guide that he started while based in Southern Africa. But before he retired, he was also Strategy and Research Director for WEC, the World Evangelization for Christ organization. He now lives in the Midlands of England with his wife, Robin. Patrick, over to you.
Thank you very much. Just by way of introducing myself, I was 16 years in Africa, and that's where I wrote the first Operation World. And this is it. You can hardly see it there. And this book was written to help Africans pray for the world. So I often say that Operation World is actually an African book. And when I speak in African conferences, I say really in the middle of this century, Nigeria and African countries could be the lead for mission expansion in the middle of this century, because it will be the only useful continent left. Anyway, there's my point. Here's the first full Operation World that we did, covering every country of the world. I don't know how many copies were issued of the book in its various editions, but I think it's probably around 3 million. And so it has had quite an influence, but we had to learn many lessons as we went through. When I started, I wanted to set up basic guidelines of how I was to operate. And one of the things that I set myself to do was to keep what I call 100% rule. And it's about that that I want to speak in my brief time this afternoon, in my time this afternoon. Basically, what I mean by this is that every bit of population we are handling, all the figures must add up to the total of all the people. In other words, if you count up all the ethnic groups in a country, that total you get at the end must equal the national population of the country. And the same with Christians, that if we're dealing with all the Christians in the country, the number of denominations and the people outside the church that call themselves Christian must all add up to 100%. Only then can you actually check whether you've got all the results you need. And it also then gives an overview, it gives the whole picture. And my challenge to you is that whatever research you do, which involves dealing with analyzing a section of the population, whether it be national, regional, city, whatever, it must add up to 100%. Now, William Carey had this problem. He wrote his inquiry into the obligation of Christians to use means for the conversion of the heathen. And in the process, he also did some research. The latter part of the book actually gives a lot of statistics, the best he could give. But he wanted to give a picture of the whole world's population when there was so little information available. And he made an attempt. And it's interesting for us to look back at his figures to see how reasonable his figures were. In some, he was reasonably correct, and in others, he was wildly out. But he made that attempt. He wanted to give an overall coverage. So that's what I wanted to do with Operation World. And nobody had really done that before. But then when I met with David Barrett in the 1970s, we then started working together, and we both had this vision that we had to keep that to that 100% rule. And so I just want to illustrate some of the kind of problems that we met in the process. Now I'm just going to take population figures, and then I'm going to take denominational figures. I could go on if I had time to deal with deficiencies in information on peoples, but that we're going to cover later on in our program. But look at the problem that we have with population. Census figures are really valuable, but so often they are distorted. We find, for instance, in communist countries, they deliberately manipulated the figures to give the kind of message they wanted. And China is in great embarrassment at the present time because they had a basic failure in their counting of people. And the latest census they had suddenly revealed that they had 100 million people less than they were expecting. And the reason for that was that government officials were submitting to the central government inflated figures for births, because when they had more births, they got more money from the central government. And so when you get that kind of distortion, it's very hard to get objective figures. It's the same when you come to a Hindu country like India, in dealing with the religious figures. They so often cooked the figures in some states, and you could actually see where they had actually done this once you looked at the figures more closely. They wanted to diminish the number of Christians to a certain low level that it pleased the Hindu majority. The Muslims, they are famous or infamous for deliberately undercounting non-Muslims. And so it's very hard to get true figures for a country like Pakistan or Indonesia, because they do not want to recognize some of the work that God is doing. And so census figures help, but you must read them with caution and try and understand the limitations. But we also have democratic countries that make a mess. We had a census in the United Kingdom in 2021. And the Scottish figures have been grossly distorted because they made some stupid mistakes in the counting. So all the figures for Scotland for 2021 are hardly valid. And so that's the kind of problem we have with census figures. The United Nations have got a whole team of researchers who take the global figures and try and process them and adjust them and understand where the mistakes are. And they then produce these remarkable figures that we use very much in our research. And I constantly go back to the UN figures on cities, on countries, and so on. They are excellent, but they too have their deficiencies. For instance, they have to be politically correct. So when you come to a country like China, which includes all Taiwan figures in mainland China figures, although they don't rule the island of Taiwan. And so if you want to do statistics on Taiwan, as I had to with Operation World, you've got to actually extract all the figures from China and then adjust the figures of China. So as researchers, we have to be very cautious about publications and look at the situation, how valid they are, and find out where the missing data is or where it has been distorted. And there are other cases where the United Nations has had to be very politically correct. For instance, it's illegal for anything to be sold in India that shows the whole of Kashmir as not part of India, but part of it is ruled by Pakistan. And so you get these kind of things where the United Nations has to bow to the political demands of members. And so we need to be very aware of that. The second one is on denominations. And we faced a huge problem in dealing with denominations. Michael Jafarian, I believe, referred to the missionary atlases and the figures that were produced for the 1910 mission conference in Edinburgh. And of course, that whole series of missionary atlases had quite a few statistics in it, including some denominational. But they didn't have anything that really summed up according to that 100% rule. Then after World War II came the World Christian Handbooks that morphed eventually when David Barrett took over into the World Christian Encyclopedia. But those World Christian Handbooks were the only source of data that I had for the first Operation World in 1965. And so I devoured them but had to realize there were great deficiencies. And because Kenneth Grubb, in his doing of those volumes, did not keep to that 100% rule. He didn't like Catholics, so he put them in eventually into an appendix. But they weren't part of the main statistics. But if you don't have a whole picture of the entire Christian world, you're going to give a distorted figure. And so I really wanted to have that 100% rule for the religions and the Christian, the different Christian streams. But then we found that we had so little data to work on. Even the World Christian Handbook had statistics for members without clearly defining what members were, and adherents or affiliates, and 2 columns. And sometimes they had the number of churches. Because basically, as we look at the Christian world, if we're going to count up all the Christians, we have to count up numbers that have the same meaning. And there are basically 4 different ways that denominations have of giving their numbers. For instance, some churches, especially Pentecostal and fast-growing churches, tend to say the number of churches they have, but they don't give any membership figures because it's rapidly changing. And so how do you get figures for these, for the members, for the affiliates, for the how many come to a church? And there are these 4 figures for which it is essential we have to get a count for all 4 figures for every denomination in the world. And David Barrett and I both worked semi-autonomously trying to gather that information. We shared lots of information backwards and forwards. But basically, we needed those 4 statistics. David, of course, when he did the 1981 World Christian Encyclopedia, just wanted to give a snapshot of the Christian world as best he could, and the whole world. But as we dug deeper into the 1981 statistics, we found 2 basic failings that we also had to then rectify. One was that there was no source given for the figures. And secondly, there was no date given either. And so when we gradually put together statistics that covered decades, we saw where the errors were and where probably the date of the statistics were. So if you look at the World Christian Encyclopedia of 1981, you'll find some of those statistics were 20 years old. And there was no indication that this was the case. So there's another important principle I would just encourage you with. Do make sure that you always give source and date for every statistic that you have in your database. Anyway, we gradually worked out a system with ratios or percentages between each of these numbers to try and fill in the data that was missing. We had to look at so many factors. What's the birth rate in the country? What's the age profile of the denomination? How long has it existed? To work out approximately what the 4 figures might be. And always in our statistics, we put down that it was a derived figure, that there was one figure we had and the other figures were derived from it. And then we also had estimates. We had to interpolate or extrapolate to beyond the figures that we had to be able to cover each 5-year period. And in this way, we were gradually able to fill up all the gaps and to make totals. And eventually the encyclopedia also took up this system as well. And basically, once you do that, you can then make the totals according to the 100% rule. And you may find that the number of Christians is far beyond what any possibility exists. A case like this is Korea, where there are about 200 Presbyterian denominations today, and they don't usually clean up their membership lists. And so many Korean Christians belong to 3 or 4 denominations, and they're counted by each. And so if we added up all the denominations that exist in Korea, they make up more than half the population, which is not the actual state of affairs. So you've got to make allowances for that, for double counting, or undercounting in countries where there are persecution. But the basic thing is that we did need statistics that filled every slot, but to clearly show where the difficulties were.
Patrick, I'm going to need you to wrap up
yes,
soon.
I will wrap up. 1 more minute.
Yep.
And what we then did, we were able to put all the figures together for the 1993 Operation World, according to this system. It was interesting that in the 2001 World Christian Encyclopedia, David, I think with a lot of help from Michael Jafarian, actually took out of the 1993 database all the Operation World figures for many countries and put them straight into the encyclopedia. That was quite an honor that should happen, but no account was given from where the source was. But anyway, the important point I want to say is that if you are going to work with population, you need to work in such a way that all the figures add up to 100%. And if it doesn't, you've got to find out the reason and adjust your estimates, or find out where you've made mistakes or where mistaken figures were given to you. And so that is one of the important things that I have found in my research. Over to you, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Patrick. Patrick is planning to stay on after the meeting has formally closed. So if you want to ask questions, you may be able to do so at that point.